Carl Jung understood something that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. There is a war happening inside your mind, a conflict so fundamental, so pervasive, so exhausting that it shapes everything you do, everything you feel, everything you become. This is not the occasional internal debate about what choice to make or which path to follow. This is constant warfare between forces you do not fully recognize, between parts of yourself that have opposing goals, between the person you believe yourself to be and the aspects of yourself that you have rejected, denied, buried in the unconscious, where they continue operating without your awareness or consent. This internal war is not pathology that therapy can eliminate or medication can suppress. It is the fundamental condition of human consciousness, the inevitable consequence of having a psyche divided against itself, the price of civilization that requires suppressing instincts and desires that cannot be accommodated in social existence. Jung spent his life mapping this internal battlefield, identifying the combatants, understanding their strategies, recognizing that what appears to be single unified self is actually a collection of conflicting forces, competing drives, contradictory impulses that are never fully reconciled, but only managed, negotiated, integrated, to whatever degree proves possible. Most people never recognize this war explicitly, but experience its effects constantly. The exhaustion that has no physical cause, the self-sabotage that undermines success, the repetitive patterns that consciousness cannot seem to break, the dreams that disturb and perplex, the emotions that arise without reason and resist all efforts at control. These are not random dysfunctions, but are symptoms of the hidden war, signals from the unconscious forces that consciousness has tried to suppress but cannot eliminate, manifestations of the conflict between what you want to be and what you actually are beneath the carefully maintained surface. Understanding Jung means understanding this war, recognizing the forces in conflict, seeing how the battle shapes your life, whether you acknowledge it or not. This is the hidden war inside your mind. The primary battlefield in Jung's psychology is the divide between consciousness and the unconscious, between the small portion of the psyche that you are aware of and identify as yourself, and the vast territory beneath awareness that contains everything you have rejected, suppressed, forgotten, or never knew existed. Consciousness believes itself to be in control, believes it directs thought and action, believes it knows itself and understands its motivations. But Jung recognized that consciousness is not sovereign, is not master of its own house, is more like a small island floating on a vast ocean of unconscious processes that consciousness can neither see nor control. This unconscious is not simply storage for forgotten memories or repository for experiences that have faded from awareness. It is active, intelligent, purposeful, constantly working according to its own logic and goals that often conflict with what consciousness intends. The unconscious sends dreams that disturb and perplex. It generates emotions that seem to come from nowhere. It creates symptoms that consciousness cannot explain. It sabotages plans that consciousness carefully constructed. It drives behaviors that consciousness condemns. And it does all this not from malice but from its own nature, from forces and drives and complexes that have their own validity even when they contradict what consciousness wants. The war begins in childhood when the developing ego, the center of consciousness, starts to form identity by choosing which aspects of experience to include and which to exclude. The child learns quickly that some feelings and impulses bring reward while others bring punishment, that some aspects of self are acceptable while others must be hidden. The impulse to hit is punished, so it is suppressed. The desire to cry is shamed, so it is contained. The natural selfishness is condemned, so it is denied. Each suppression creates psychic split, sends the rejected aspect into the unconscious, where it does not die but continues existing in shadow, continues operating but now without conscious awareness or control. By adulthood, vast portions of the psyche have been exiled to the unconscious, have been deemed unacceptable by the ego's standards, have been judged as incompatible with the identity consciousness has constructed. But these exiled aspects do not simply disappear. They form what Jung called complexes, organized patterns of emotion and memory and desire that have their own autonomy, that can be triggered by specific situations, that can temporarily take control when consciousness is weakened by stress or exhaustion or strong emotion. The person experiences this as being overwhelmed, as losing control, as doing or saying things they later regret and cannot fully explain. The calm professional suddenly explodes in rage. The loving parent becomes cruel. The moral person acts shamefully. These are not simply lapses in willpower, but are moments when unconscious complexes break through, when the suppressed aspects seize control, when the hidden war becomes visible through behaviors that consciousness did not choose and cannot fully own. But the war is not only between consciousness and unconscious in general. It is between specific structures within the psyche that Jung identified as having different functions, different goals, different ways of operating. The ego wants control and consistency and rational understanding. The shadow contains all the rejected and denied aspects. The anima or animus represents the contrasexual elements that have been suppressed. The self represents the totality, the wholeness that includes all these partial aspects. Each of these structures has its own agenda, its own needs, its own methods of asserting itself when denied or neglected. The ego tries to maintain a consistent identity, tries to be the person it believes it should be, tries to control behavior and thought and feeling according to conscious values and goals. But the shadow undermines this constantly, introduces impulses and desires that contradict the ego's self-image, forces recognition of qualities the ego has tried to deny. The anima or animus creates attractions and projections that consciousness cannot explain or control. The self pushes toward integration and wholeness in ways that threaten the ego's narrow identity and comfortable self-concept. These are not merely theoretical structures, but are lived experiences, are the actual forces that create internal conflict, that generate the sense of being divided against yourself, of wanting contradictory things simultaneously, of sabotaging goals you consciously pursue, of being driven by motivations you do not understand and cannot fully acknowledge. The war is not metaphor, but is accurate description of how the psyche actually operates, as battlefield, where different forces compete, where consciousness and unconscious struggle for dominance, where the person is simultaneously combatant and territory being fought over. Most people are not aware they are fighting this war because consciousness has learned to not see what threatens it, has developed defenses that prevent recognition of internal conflict, has constructed narratives that maintain illusion of unity and control, even while the war rages beneath awareness. They attribute their difficulties to external circumstances, to other people, to bad luck, never recognizing that the primary obstacle to their goals is internal, is the hidden war that consciousness refuses to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would require admitting that the ego is not sovereign, that consciousness is not in control, that the person they believe themselves to be is only partial truth about who they actually are. The shadow is Jung's term for everything about yourself that you cannot accept, everything you have judged as wrong or weak or shameful or dangerous, everything that contradicts the image you want to maintain. The shadow contains your cruelty when you identify as kind, your selfishness when you identify as generous, your cowardice when you identify as brave, your stupidity when you identify as intelligent, your weakness when you identify as strong. It is not simply negative qualities, but is everything excluded from the ego's self-concept, everything deemed incompatible with who you believe yourself to be. The formation of the shadow is not pathological, but is inevitable consequence of developing a conscious identity. You cannot include everything in your self-concept, cannot accept every impulse and desire and quality, cannot build coherent identity without excluding aspects that do not fit. The child who is naturally aggressive must suppress this aggression to be accepted in civilized society. The person who wants to be seen as good must deny their capacity for evil. The individual striving for success must reject their desire to give up and do nothing. Each exclusion builds the shadow, sends rejected aspects into darkness where they accumulate power precisely because they are denied. But the shadow does not remain passive. It fights back constantly, seeks expression, demands recognition, finds ways to manifest despite the ego's efforts to keep it suppressed. This is the war's most visible front, the conflict between the person you try to be and the impulses that betray what you actually are beneath the constructed image. The shadow appears in slips of the tongue that reveal what you were thinking but did not intend to say. It appears in mistakes and accidents that accomplish what consciousness would not permit deliberately. It appears in dreams where you do things you would never consciously choose, where you are the villain rather than the hero, where your denied qualities are given free expression. Most dangerously, the shadow appears through projection, through seeing in others the qualities you cannot accept in yourself. The person who cannot acknowledge their own cruelty sees cruelty everywhere in others, becomes hypervigilant for it, judges it harshly, feels morally superior to those who display what they themselves possess but deny. The person who has rejected their sexuality sees others as perverted, as overly sexual, as threatening or disgusting in their sexual nature. The person who cannot accept their weakness sees others as pathetic, as needing to toughen up, as contemptible in their vulnerability. Projection is not conscious dishonesty but is automatic psychological mechanism, is the psyche's way of externalizing what cannot be accepted internally, is the shadow's method of being seen, even when consciousness refuses to see it in itself. The intensity of reaction reveals the projection. What you judge most harshly in others points directly to what you have most thoroughly rejected in yourself. What disturbs you most about others indicates what disturbs you most about the shadow you carry but do not acknowledge. The war intensifies because projection creates external enemies who are actually internal aspects, turns the internal conflict into external conflict, makes you fight in the world the battle you are actually fighting within yourself. The person who projects their shadow onto others spends their life battling enemies who carry the very qualities they deny in themselves, never recognizing that the war is not out there but is inside, that the enemy is not other people but is the rejected self they refuse to face. Jung understood that integration of the shadow is essential for psychological health, but is work that most people never undertake, because it requires facing what the ego has spent lifetime avoiding, requires admitting to qualities and impulses that threaten the carefully maintained self-image, requires accepting that you are not who you believe yourself to be, but contain everything you have condemned in others. This is humbling work, is deflation of ego's grandiosity, is recognition that the person you present to the world and the person you believe yourself to be are both constructions that exclude vast territories of who you actually are. The person who integrates their shadow does not become evil or give in to destructive impulses. They become more complete, more honest, more capable of genuine relationship because they are no longer projecting their denied aspects onto others, no longer judging harshly what they see in others because they have accepted it in themselves. They become less rigid, more flexible, more capable of responding to situations from wholeness rather than from the partial identity the ego constructed through years of exclusion and denial. But integration requires first recognizing that the shadow exists, that the war is real, that consciousness is fighting against aspects of self that have been rejected but remain active, remain powerful, remain determinative of behavior, even when consciousness refuses to see them. This recognition is the first casualty of the ego's defenses, is what consciousness most wants to avoid, is the truth that threatens everything the false unity depends upon. Jung identified another front in the internal war, the conflict with what he called the anima in men and the animus in women, the contrasexual elements that exist within every psyche but are suppressed because they contradict the gender identity that society demands. The man develops a conscious masculine identity by rejecting qualities coded as feminine: emotionality, receptivity, gentleness, vulnerability, intuition. These rejected qualities do not disappear but form the anima, an inner feminine figure that appears in dreams and fantasies, that influences mood and attraction, that creates the man's relationship to his own emotional and intuitive life. the woman develops conscious feminine identity by rejecting qualities coded as masculine: aggression, rationality, assertiveness, independence, analytical thinking. These form the animus, an inner masculine figure that appears as opinions and judgments, that creates her relationship to her own thinking and assertive capacities, that influences how she relates to authority and power and intellectual life. These contrasexual elements create internal warfare because they represent everything the conscious gender identity has had to exclude to conform to social expectations. Everything that was deemed incompatible with being properly male or properly female, everything that threatens the gender performance that society rewards and its violation punishes. The man who is fully identified with conventional masculinity is at war with his own emotional and receptive capacities, experiences them as weakness or as threat to his masculine identity, suppresses them rigidly until they erupt in ways he cannot control. This eruption often occurs through projection onto actual women, through falling in love in ways that consciousness cannot explain or control, through being overwhelmed by emotions that seem to come from the woman but are actually the man's own suppressed anima being activated by her presence. The man projects his anima onto a woman and experiences her as having magical qualities, as being the perfect embodiment of everything he lacks, as completing him in ways he cannot complete himself. This is not genuine seeing of the actual woman, but is projection of his own rejected feminine qualities, is the anima being seen in her, rather than being recognized as internal. Similarly, the woman who has rigidly identified with conventional femininity projects her animus onto men, experiences them as having the strength and decisiveness and rational clarity she has rejected in herself, falls into relationships where she depends on men to provide what she actually possesses but cannot access, where she looks outside for the assertiveness and intellectual authority that exist within her own psyche but have been suppressed as incompatible with feminine identity. These projections create relationships that are not genuine meetings between two whole people, but are two partial people, each projecting their rejected aspects onto the other, each depending on the other to carry what they cannot acknowledge in themselves, each at war with internal elements that appear to exist outside. The relationship becomes battlefield, where the internal war is fought through external conflict, where each person fights in the partner the qualities they cannot accept in themselves, where intimacy is impossible because neither is actually seeing the other but only their own projections. The war with the anima or animus also appears in internal experience, in the moods and compulsions and autonomous thoughts that seem to come from nowhere, that consciousness cannot control, that take over despite the ego's intentions. The man is suddenly overwhelmed by emotion he cannot explain or justify, is possessed by moody irritability or sullen withdrawal or sentimental softness that contradicts his masculine identity. The woman is suddenly possessed by harsh judgments and rigid opinions that are not her own reflective thoughts but are the animus speaking through her, are the suppressed masculine rationality erupting in distorted form. Jung understood that integration of the anima or animus requires developing the rejected contrasexual qualities, requires the man to develop his emotional and intuitive capacities, not as feminine weakness, but as human capacities that exist in everyone, regardless of gender, requires the woman to develop her rational and assertive capacities, not as masculine aggression, but as human capacities that everyone possesses. This does not mean abandoning gender identity, but means recognizing that the rigid gender role society enforces require suppressing aspects of humanity that exist in everyone, require creating internal division where wholeness should exist. But this integration threatens everything society has built on gender division, threatens the roles and expectations and power dynamics that depend on men and women being fundamentally different and complementary, rather than being whole humans who both contain masculine and feminine capacities. The war with the anima or animus is not just personal but is cultural, is the individual psyche, carrying the larger society's investment in maintaining gender divisions that require each person to suppress half of their humanity. The person who refuses this integration, who rigidly maintains the gender identity society demands, remains at war with internal aspects that will not be eliminated, that will continue erupting through projections and moods and compulsions, that will create relationships based on mutual projection rather than genuine meeting, that will prevent the wholeness that integration would provide. Another major front in the hidden war is the conflict between the ego and what Jung called the persona, the social mask we wear, the role we perform for others, the identity we construct to navigate social demands. The persona is necessary, is the interface between the private self and the public world, is how we adapt to different contexts and meet different social expectations. But the persona becomes problematic when it is confused with the actual self, when the mask is mistaken for the face, when the role becomes so convincing that even the person performing it believes the performance is who they actually are. The ego wants to maintain some coherence, some sense of authentic identity beneath the various roles. But social pressures demand that the persona be maintained consistently, that the performance never slip, that the public image be protected at all costs. This creates internal tension between what is genuinely felt and what must be displayed, between authentic response and socially acceptable expression, between who you are and who you must appear to be. The person smiles when angry, agrees when disagreeing, performs enthusiasm when feeling empty, maintains the persona even when it contradicts internal reality. Over time, the persona can become rigid, can calcify into fixed identity that allows no deviation, that demands the person continue performing even in private, even when alone, even when the audience is gone. The successful businessman cannot drop the performance of confidence and competence even at home. The caring mother cannot stop performing nurturing and selflessness even when exhausted and resentful. The intellectual cannot stop performing erudition and sophistication even when confused or uncertain. The persona has become prison, has trapped the person in performance they can no longer escape. This rigidity creates war between the demands of the persona and the needs of the actual self beneath it. The persona requires constant vigilance, constant control, constant suppression of anything that would contradict the image. But the actual self has needs and desires and feelings that cannot all be accommodated within the persona's narrow constraints, that push for expression, that resist being suppressed indefinitely. The person feels increasingly disconnected from their own life, feels they are watching themselves perform rather than actually living, experiences growing exhaustion from maintaining the persona while denying everything that does not fit. The war intensifies because the persona is rewarded by society, brings approval and acceptance and success, makes the person valuable to others in ways that the authentic self might not be. The persona is what gets promoted, what gets admired, what gets loved by those who relate to the performance rather than to the person beneath it. This creates powerful incentive to continue the performance, to maintain the persona even at cost of authenticity, to win the war by suppressing the authentic self rather than by integrating it. But the authentic self does not accept defeat quietly. It creates symptoms that consciousness cannot ignore, depression that achievement does not cure, anxiety that has no apparent cause, physical ailments that medical examination cannot explain, dreams that disturb and perplex, sudden emotional breakdowns that seem to come from nowhere. These are not random dysfunctions, but are the authentic self's rebellion against the persona's tyranny, are signals that the war cannot continue indefinitely without cost, are warnings that something essential is being sacrificed to maintain the performance. Jung called this condition identification with the persona, the mistake of believing you are the role you perform, the confusion of the mask with the face beneath. The person so identified cannot distinguish between what they genuinely feel and what the persona requires them to feel, cannot separate their own desires from the desires the role demands they have, cannot recognize that they are performing because the performance has become so automatic, so complete, so thoroughly integrated that it no longer feels like performance but feels like simply being themselves. This identification prevents genuine relationship because what others relate to is the persona rather than the person. is the performance rather than the authentic being beneath it. The person can be surrounded by admirers and feel completely alone because no one actually knows them, because every relationship is with the mask rather than with the face, because connection based on persona cannot satisfy the authentic self that remains hidden and unknown and fundamentally isolated despite appearing successful and connected and loved. The war between ego and persona is therefore war about identity itself, about whether the person will live primarily as performance for others or will risk the authentic being that might not be as acceptable, as successful, as admired. Most choose the persona, choose the performance, choose the rewards of maintaining the mask over the uncertain possibility of being known as they actually are. But this choice does not end the war, only suppresses one side of it, creates victory for persona that is actually defeat for the whole person who is more than just the role they perform. The deepest and most consequential front in the hidden war is the conflict between the ego and what Jung called the self, the organizing center of the entire psyche, the totality that includes all the partial aspects, the wholeness that consciousness has fragmented through years of exclusion and identification and rigid boundary making. The ego is small, is the center of consciousness, is the I that you identify with, that makes decisions, that believes itself to be sovereign. The self is vast, includes consciousness and unconscious, includes ego and shadow and all rejected aspects, represents the person you could become if all the warring factions were integrated rather than remaining in conflict. The war between ego and self is not between equals. The ego is a small island on vast ocean, is a candle flame in the darkness, is a fragment, believing itself to be the whole. But the ego has enormous investment in maintaining this illusion, has constructed entire identity around being the center, around being in control, around being the self, rather than merely part of a larger self that the ego cannot fully see or comprehend. The ego fears the self because the self's emergence threatens the ego's sovereignty, threatens to relativize the ego's importance, threatens to reveal that what consciousness thinks of as I is only partial truth about the totality of who you are. This conflict manifests through what Jung called the individuation process, the psyche's inherent drive toward wholeness, toward integration of the scattered parts, toward becoming the complete person, rather than remaining the partial ego identifying with even more partial persona. The self pushes the person toward experiences that will force growth, that will challenge the ego's limited identity, that will require incorporating aspects that have been rejected or denied. This appears to consciousness as crisis, as everything going wrong, as the life carefully constructed falling apart, because the ego experiences the self's intervention as threat rather than as development. The person encounters situations that cannot be handled by the ego's usual strategies, that require capacities the ego does not possess, that force confrontation with rejected shadow elements or suppressed anima or animus or denied emotional depths. The successful career person is forced into situation requiring vulnerability they have never developed. The independent person encounters dependency they cannot avoid. The rational person is overwhelmed by emotions they cannot control or understand. These are not accidents, but are the self-orchestrating experiences that will crack the ego's rigidity, that will force expansion, that will create possibility of integration. But the ego fights back, resists the self's demands, attempts to maintain the familiar identity and the comfortable boundaries. The person refuses to see what the crisis is trying to teach, rebuilds the collapsed structures, retreats into old patterns, defends against the growth that the self is pushing toward. This creates stalemate where the self continues creating crises and the ego continues resisting them, where the war continues without resolution, where the person remains stuck in patterns that consciousness recognizes as destructive, but cannot seem to break because breaking them would require surrendering to the self's demands. The war manifests in dreams that the ego cannot understand, cannot integrate, cannot control. The self speaks through dreams in symbolic language, presents images and narratives that reveal the larger truth about who the person is beyond the ego's limited self-concept, that show the rejected aspects that need integration, that map the journey the person needs to take toward wholeness. But the ego dismisses these dreams as meaningless, as random firings of neurons, as nothing important, because taking them seriously would mean acknowledging that something larger than ego is operating, that consciousness is not sovereign, that the I is not the whole story. The conflict also appears through symptoms that consciousness cannot explain or eliminate through willpower or rational understanding. Physical ailments with no medical cause, anxiety that therapy cannot fully address, depression that achievement does not cure, compulsions that consciousness condemns but cannot stop, relationship patterns that repeat despite conscious determination to choose differently. These are not merely dysfunctions, but are the self-demanding attention, are signals that the ego's limited identity is inadequate, are invitations to the expansion that individuation requires. Jung understood that this war cannot be won by either side. The ego cannot eliminate the self, cannot maintain rigid boundaries indefinitely, cannot prevent the unconscious from erupting through symptoms and dreams and crises. But the self also cannot simply overwhelm the ego, cannot force integration, cannot make the person whole through domination. What is required is not victory, but is negotiation, is development of what Jung called the transcendent function, is the capacity to hold the tension between ego and self without collapsing into either pole, is the gradual process through which the ego learns to serve the self rather than fighting it. Jung identified another crucial element in the internal war: the complexes, autonomous psychic entities that form around emotionally charged experiences, particularly traumatic or unresolved situations that consciousness could not fully process or integrate. These complexes are not under ego's control, operate according to their own logic, can be triggered by specific situations, and temporarily take control of consciousness, creating moments where the person acts in ways they later cannot fully explain or own. A complex forms when an experience is too intense or too threatening for consciousness to fully metabolize, when the emotion overwhelms the ego's capacity to integrate it, when something happens that contradicts the self-concept so completely that consciousness cannot acknowledge it without disintegration. The experience is split off, is cordoned away from conscious awareness, forms a pocket in the psyche that contains the original emotion and the associated memories and the beliefs that were formed in that moment of overwhelm. This complex does not remain passive. It has its own life, its own agenda, its own methods of asserting itself when situations trigger the original wound. The person who was humiliated in childhood carries a humiliation complex that can be triggered decades later by situations that contain even slight echoes of the original experience. The person who was abandoned carries an abandonment complex that colors all their relationships, creates fears and behaviors that consciousness cannot control through reason, because the complex operates from emotional logic rather than from rational thought. When a complex is activated, when something in present experience triggers it, the person is temporarily possessed, temporarily loses access to their ordinary rational functioning, temporarily becomes the wounded child or the traumatized adolescent or whatever age they were when the complex formed. They react with intensity that seems disproportionate to present circumstances because they are not actually responding to present circumstances, but are responding to past trauma that the present situation has activated. The war with complexes is particularly insidious because consciousness often does not recognize when it is possessed, often believes the extreme reaction is justified by present circumstances, often constructs rational explanations for behavior that is actually driven by unconscious emotional patterns. The person whose abandonment complex is triggered believes they are simply responding to their partner's actual behavior, does not recognize that the intensity of their fear and their clinging and their accusations comes not from present reality but from past wounds that have been reactivated. These complexes create repetitive patterns that consciousness cannot break because consciousness is trying to solve the wrong problem. is trying to change present behavior without addressing the past trauma that drives it, is attempting willpower and rational understanding, when what is needed is integration of the split-off experience that formed the complex. The person keeps entering relationships that replicate the original trauma, keeps finding themselves in situations that trigger the same responses, keeps making the same mistakes despite conscious determination to choose differently. The complex's war with the ego's desire for control and rationality and consistency. The ego wants to believe it directs behavior, wants to maintain stable identity, wants to operate from conscious values and intentions. But the complexes hijack this control regularly, create behaviors that contradict conscious intentions, force the person to act in ways they later regret and cannot fully explain, demonstrate that consciousness is not sovereign but shares the psyche with autonomous forces that can temporarily seize control. Jung understood that the work with complexes is not about eliminating them, which is impossible because they are formed from real experiences that cannot be erased, but is about recognizing them, understanding their origins, reducing their autonomy through bringing them into relationship with consciousness. When a complex is recognized, when the person understands that their extreme reaction is not about present circumstances but is about past trauma being triggered, the complex loses some of its power, becomes less autonomous, becomes more integrated into conscious awareness. But this recognition is difficult because it requires admitting that you are not in control, that your reactions are not always proportionate to circumstances, that you are being driven by forces you do not fully understand, that the person you believe yourself to be is only partial truth. And beneath this is wounded child or traumatized adolescent who still operates according to logic formed in moments of overwhelm. The ego resists this recognition because it threatens the illusion of sovereignty, threatens the belief that you are a rational adult in control of your responses, threatens the identity that has been carefully constructed to distance yourself from the vulnerability and woundedness that the complexes contain. The war with complexes is therefore a war about whether consciousness will expand to include these split-off aspects, will recognize that integration requires facing the original trauma and the emotions that were too intense to be processed when they occurred, will do the difficult work of bringing the autonomous complexes into relationship with conscious awareness, rather than continuing to be hijacked by them without recognition or understanding. Jung's ultimate insight about the hidden war is that it cannot be won, cannot be resolved through one side achieving complete victory, cannot end with consciousness eliminating the unconscious, or with the ego destroying the shadow, or with the persona becoming the only identity. The war is inherent in having a psyche, is built into the structure of consciousness that can only exist by creating boundaries and exclusions, is the inevitable consequence of being human rather than being simple organism operating purely from instinct. But the war can be transformed, can shift from destructive conflict to creative tension, can become the dynamic that generates growth rather than the stalemate that creates suffering. This transformation is what Jung called individuation, the process through which the warring factions are brought into relationship with each other, where consciousness learns to recognize and negotiate with unconscious forces rather than simply trying to suppress them, where the ego serves the self rather than fighting it, where integration replaces fragmentation as the organizing principle. Individuation does not mean eliminating conflict, but means developing what Jung called the transcendent function, the capacity to hold the tension between opposites without collapsing into either pole, without resolving the contradiction prematurely through suppression or identification. The person learns to contain both ego and shadow, both persona and authentic self, both masculine and feminine elements, both consciousness and unconscious, without requiring that one eliminate the other, without needing to choose sides in the war. This holding of tension is extraordinarily difficult because the ego wants resolution, wants clarity, wants to know who it is and what it should do, wants to eliminate the ambiguity and contradiction that the transcendent function requires maintaining. The ego wants to be either good or bad, either strong or weak, either masculine or feminine, either in control or surrendering control. The transcendent function says you are both. You contain opposites. You must learn to be paradox, rather than seeking false unity through exclusion. The development of the transcendent function occurs through attending to dreams, through recognizing when complexes are activated, through withdrawing projections and owning what you have placed onto others, through facing the shadow rather than denying it, through integrating the anima or animus rather than projecting these elements, through allowing the self to guide rather than the ego insisting on its sovereignty. This is not linear process, but is cyclical, is repeated confrontations with the same issues at deeper levels, is lifelong work rather than destination reached and completed. The person engaged in individuation does not become perfect or achieve complete integration or reach state where the war ends and peace reigns permanently. They become more conscious of the war, more able to recognize when they are possessed by complexes, or when they are projecting shadow, or when the persona has become too rigid, or when the ego is fighting the self's demands. This consciousness does not prevent the conflict, but changes the relationship to it, makes it possible to work with the warring factions, rather than being helplessly caught between them. The practical result is not serenity, but is increased capacity for genuine living, for authentic relationship, for creative engagement with life's challenges, for psychological flexibility that allows responding to situations from wholeness rather than from the ego's limited perspective or from unconscious possession by complexes. The person becomes more real, more present, more capable of genuine connection because they are no longer rigidly defending against aspects of themselves, no longer projecting their denied qualities onto others, no longer trapped in repetitive patterns driven by unconscious complexes. But individuation is rare. Most people never undertake this work, never recognize the war explicitly, never do the difficult labor of integration that Jung described. They remain caught in unconscious conflict, remain possessed by complexes they do not recognize, remain at war with aspects of themselves they deny, remain trapped in patterns they cannot break, because they cannot see the unconscious forces driving the patterns. The question Jung poses is whether you will remain unconscious of the war, will continue being battlefield where forces you do not recognize fight for control, will live your entire life driven by conflicts you never understood, or whether you will recognize the war, will begin the difficult work of integration, will develop the capacity to hold the tension between the warring factions rather than being torn apart by them, will undertake the individuation process that might transform destructive conflict into creative tension. Conclusion: Carl Jung's greatest contribution was revealing that consciousness is not sovereign, that the I you identify with is only a small part of the total psyche, that beneath awareness there are forces operating according to their own logic and pursuing their own goals that often conflict with what consciousness intends. The hidden war inside your mind is not pathology to be cured, but is fundamental condition of being human, is the inevitable consequence of having consciousness that can only exist through creating boundaries and exclusions, through dividing the psyche into conscious and unconscious, ego and shadow, persona and authentic self. This war manifests constantly through symptoms that consciousness cannot fully explain. The exhaustion that has no physical cause, the self-sabotage that undermines conscious goals, the repetitive patterns that rational understanding cannot break, the extreme reactions that seem disproportionate to circumstances, the dreams that disturb and perplex, the sense of being divided against yourself. These are not random dysfunctions but are signals of the hidden war, are the unconscious forces making themselves known through the only channels available when consciousness refuses to recognize them directly. The primary battlefields are multiple and overlapping. The conflict between consciousness and the unconscious, where the small territory of awareness tries to maintain control over vast regions it cannot see. The war with the shadow, where the ego fights against every quality it has rejected as incompatible with its self-concept. The struggle with the anima or animus, where the person suppresses the contrasexual elements that society has deemed inappropriate for their gender. The tension between ego and persona, where authentic self is sacrificed to maintain social performance. The conflict with complexes, where autonomous patterns formed from past trauma hijack present responses. And the deepest war between ego and self, where the small fragment fights against the totality that would relativize its importance. Jung understood that this war cannot be won by either side, cannot be resolved through consciousness eliminating the unconscious, or through the ego destroying the shadow, or through the persona becoming the only identity. What is required is not victory, but is integration, is bringing the warring factions into relationship with each other, is developing the transcendent function that can hold tension between opposites without collapsing into either pole, is the individuation process through which fragmented psyche moves toward wholeness. This work is difficult and rare. Most people never undertake it, never recognize the war explicitly, remain unconscious combatants in conflicts they do not understand, remain driven by forces they cannot see, remain trapped in patterns they cannot break because they cannot recognize the unconscious dynamics creating the patterns. They attribute their difficulties to external circumstances, to other people, to bad luck, never recognizing that the primary obstacle is internal, is the hidden war that consciousness refuses to acknowledge, because acknowledging it would mean admitting that the ego is not in control, that consciousness is not sovereign, that you are not who you believe yourself to be, but are far more complex and contradictory and driven by unconscious forces than the ego's self-concept allows. Understanding Jung means understanding that you are battlefield, that forces you do not fully recognize are fighting for control, that your behaviors and emotions and thoughts are often not the product of conscious intention but are the outcomes of conflicts between parts of yourself you do not acknowledge. It means recognizing that integration is possible, but requires facing what consciousness has spent lifetime avoiding, requires admitting to shadow qualities you have denied, requires integrating anima or animus elements you have suppressed, requires allowing the self to guide, rather than the ego insisting on its limited sovereignty. The choice is whether you will remain unconscious of the war, will continue being driven by forces you do not recognize, will live your entire life as battlefield, where conflicts you cannot see determine outcomes you cannot control, or whether you will recognize the war, will begin the difficult work of integration, will undertake the individuation process that Jung described as the fundamental task of the second half of life, will develop relationship with the unconscious forces rather than simply being possessed by them. The hidden war inside your mind is real. It is happening whether you acknowledge it or not. It shapes everything you do, everything you feel, everything you become. The question is whether you will fight this war unconsciously, remaining blind to the forces in conflict, or whether you will bring consciousness to the conflict, will recognize the warring factions, will do the difficult work of integration that might transform destructive conflict into creative tension. Jung offers no easy answers, no simple solutions, no promise that the work will be comfortable or that completion is possible. He offers only the recognition that consciousness is not what we believe it to be, that the psyche is far more complex and conflicted than the ego's simplified self-concept allows, that genuine living requires facing the hidden war rather than remaining its unconscious casualty. The rest is up to you.